Section 9 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Close Calculations. Truth alone, truth tangible and palpable, such truth as may be weighed and measured, truth deduced by logical conclusion, close, severe, from premises incontrovertible. Moultrie. The excitement induced by the foregoing announcement had, in a degree, subsided. The coroner, who appeared to be as much startled as any one at the results of the day's proceedings, had manifested his desire of putting certain questions to the young man, and had begun by such inquiries into his antecedents and his connection with Mrs. Clemmens as elicited the most complete corroboration of all Miss Firman's statements. An investigation into his motives for coming East at this time next followed, in the course of which he acknowledged that he undertook the journey solely for the purpose of seeing Mrs. Clemmens, and when asked why he wished to see her at this time, admitted, with some manifestation of shame, that he desired to see for himself whether she was really in as strong and healthy a condition as he had always been told, his pecuniary embarrassments being such that he could not prevent his mind from dwelling upon possibilities which, under any other circumstances, he would have been ashamed to consider. "And did you see Mrs. Clemmens?" the coroner inquired. "Yes, sir, I did." "When?" "On Tuesday, sir, about noon." The answer was given almost with bravado, and the silence among the various auditors became intense. "You admit, then, that you were in the widow's house the morning she was murdered, and that you had an interview with her a few minutes before the fatal blow was struck?" "I do." There was doggedness in the tone, and doggedness in the look that accompanied it. The coroner moved a little forward in his chair, and uttered his next question with deep gravity. "Did you approach the widow's house by the road and enter into it by means of the front door overlooking the lane?" "I did." "And did you meet no one in the lane, or see no one at the windows of any of the houses as you came by?" "No, sir." "How long did you stay in this house, and what was the result of the interview you had with Mrs. Clemmens?" "I stayed perhaps 10 minutes, and I learned nothing from Mrs. Clemmens save that she was well and hearty, and likely to live out her 80 years and 10, for all hint that her conversation or appearance gave me." He spoke almost with a tone of resentment. His eyes glowed darkly, and a thrill of horror sped through the room, as if they felt the murderer himself stood before them. "You will tell me what was said in this interview, if you please, and whether the widow knew who you were, and if so, whether any words of anger passed between you?" The face of the young man burned, and he looked at the coroner and then at the jurymen, as if he would like to challenge the whole crew, but the color that showed in his face was the flush of shame, or so thought Mr. Byrd, and in his reply, when he gave it, there was a bitterness of self-scorn that reminded the detective more of the mortification of a gentleman caught in an act of meanness than the secret alarm of a man who had been beguiled into committing a dastardly crime. "Mrs. Clemmens was evidently a woman of some spirit," said he, forcing out his words with sullen desperation. "She may have used sharp language, I believe indeed she did, but she did not know who I was, for I pretended to be a seller of patent medicine, warranted to cure all ills, and she told me she had no ills, and do you want a man to disgrace himself in your presence?" he suddenly flashed out, cringing under the gaze of the many curious and unsympathetic eyes fixed upon him. But the coroner, with a sudden assumption of severity, pardonable perhaps in a man with a case of such importance on his hands, recommended to the witness to be calm and not to allow any small feelings of personal mortification to interfere with a testimony of so much evident value, and without waiting for the witness to recover himself, asked again, What did the widow say, and with what words did you leave?" "The widow said that she abominated drugs and never took them. I replied that she made a great mistake if she had any ailments." "Upon which she retorted that she had no ailment, and politely showed me the door. I do not remember that anything else passed between us." His tone, which had been shrill and high, dropped at the final sentence, and by the nervous workings of his lips Mr. Byrd perceived that he dreaded the next question. The persons grouped around him evidently dreaded it too. But it was less searching than they expected, and proved that the coroner preferred to approach his point by circuitous rather than direct means. "In what room was the conversation held, and by what door did you come in and go out?" "I came in by the front door, and we stood in that room," pointing to the sitting room from which he had just issued. "Stood? Did you not sit down?" "No." "Stood all the time, and in that room to which you have just pointed?" "Yes." The coroner drew a deep breath, and looked at the witness long and searchingly. Mr. Hildreth's way of uttering this word had been any thing but pleasant, and consequently any thing but satisfactory. A low murmur began to eddy through the rooms. "Gentlemen, silence!" commanded the coroner, venting in this injunction some of the uncomfortable emotion with which he was evidently surcharged, for his next words were spoken in a comparatively quiet voice, though the fixed severity of his eye could have given the witness but little encouragement. "You say," he declared, "that in coming through the lane you encountered no one. Was this equally true of your return?" "Yes, sir, I believe so. I don't remember. I was not looking up," was the slightly confused reply. "You passed, however, through the lane, and entered the main street by the usual path?" "Yes." "And where did you go then?" "To the depot." "Ah!" "I wished to leave the town. I had done with it." "And did you do so, Mr. Hildreth?" "I did." "Where did you go?" "To Albany, where I left my traps." "You took the noon train, then?" "Yes, sir." "Which leaves precisely 5 minutes after 12?" "I suppose so." "Took it without stopping anywhere on the way?" "Yes, sir." "Did you buy a ticket at the office?" "No, sir." "Why?" "I did not have time." "Ah, the train was at the station, then?" Mr. Hildreth did not reply. He had evidently been driven almost to the end of his patience, or possibly of his courage, by this quick fire of small questions. The coroner saw this and pressed his advantage. "Was the train at the station or not when you arrived there, Mr. Hildreth?" "I do not see why it can interest you to know," the witness retorted, with a flash of somewhat natural anger. "But since you insist, I will tell you that it was just going out, and I had to run to reach it, and only got a foothold upon the platform of the rear car at the risk of my life." He looked as if he wished it had been at the cost of his life, and compressed his lips, and moved restlessly from side to side, as if the battery of eyes leveled upon his face were so many points of red-hot steel burning into his brain. But the coroner, intent upon his duty, released not one jot of the steady hold he had taken upon his victim. "Mr. Hildreth," said he, "your position as the only person who acknowledges himself to have been in this house during the half hour that preceded the assault makes everything you can tell us in reference to your visit of the highest importance. Was the widow alone, do you think, or did you see anything, pause now and consider well, anything that would lead you to suppose there was any one beside her and yourself in the house?" It was the suggestion of a just man, and Mr. Byrd looked to see the witness gasp with all the energy of despair at the prospect of release it held out. But Mr. Hildreth either felt his cause beyond the reach of any such assistance, or his understanding was so dulled by misery he could not see the advantage of acknowledging the presence of a third party in the cottage. Giving a dreary shake of the head, he slowly answered: There may have been somebody else in the house I don't know, but if so, I didn't hear him or see him. I thought we were alone." The frankness with which he made the admission was in his favor, but the quick and overpowering flush that rose to his face the moment he had given utterance to it betrayed so unmistakable a consciousness of what the admission had implied that the effect was immediately reversed. Seeing that he had lost rather than gained in the opinions of the merciless inquisitors about him, he went back to his old bravado, and haughtily lifted his head. "One question more," resumed the coroner. "You have said that Mrs. Clemmens was a spirited woman. Now, what made you think so? Any expression of annoyance on her part at the interruption in her work which your errand had caused her, or merely the expression of her face and the general way she had of speaking?" "The latter, I think, though she did use a harsh word or two when she showed me the door." "And raised her voice?" "Yes, yes." "Mr. Hildreth," intimated the coroner, rising, "will you be kind enough to step with me into the adjoining room?" With a look of wonder not unmixed with alarm, the young man prepared to comply. "I should like the attention of the jury," Dr. Tredwell signified as he passed through the door. There was no need to give them this hint. Not a man of them but was already on his feet in eager curiosity as to what their presiding officer was about to do. "I wish you to tell me now," the coroner demanded of Mr. Hildreth, as they paused in the center of the sitting room, "where it was you stood during your interview with Mrs. Clemmens, and, if possible, take the very position now which you held at that time." "There are too many persons here," the witness objected, visibly rebelling at a request which he could not guess the full significance. "The people present will step back," declared the coroner. "You will have no trouble in taking your stand on the spot you occupied the other day." "Here, then," exclaimed the young man, taking a position near the center of the room. "And the widow?" "Stood there." "Facing you?" "Yes." "I see," intimated the coroner, pointing toward the windows. "Her back was to the yard while you stood with your face toward it." Then, with a quick motion, summoned the witness back into the other room, asked, amid the breathless attention of the crowd, whom this bit of by play had wrought up to expectation, "Did you observe any one go around to the back door while you stood there and go away again without attempting to knock?" Mr. Hildreth knitted his brow and seemed to think. "Answer," persisted the coroner. "It is not a question that requires thought." "Well, then, I did not," cried the witness, looking the other directly in the eye, with the first gleam of real manly feeling which he had yet displayed. "You did not see a tramp come into the yard, walk around to the kitchen door, wait a moment, as if hesitating whether he would rap, and then turn and come back again without doing so?" "No, sir." The coroner drew a piece of paper before him and began figuring on it. Earnestly, almost wildly, the young man watched him, drawing a deep breath and turning quite pale as the other paused and looked up. "Yet," affirmed the coroner, as if no delay had occurred since he received his last answer, "such a person did approach the house while you were in it, and if you had stood where you say, you must have seen him." It was a vital thrust, a relentless presentation of fact, and as such shook the witness out of his lately acquired composure. Glancing hastily about, he sought the assistance of some one both capable and willing to advise him in this crisis, but seeing no one, he made a vigorous effort and called together his own faculties. "Sir," he protested, a tremor of undisguised anxiety finding way into his voice, "I do not see how you make that all out. What proof have you that this tramp of which you speak came to the house while I was in it? Could he have not come before, or, what was better, could he not have come after?" The ringing tone with which the last question was put startled everybody. No such sounds had issued from his lips before. Had he caught a glimpse of hope, or was he driven to an extremity in his defence that forced him to assert himself? The eyes of Miss Firman and a few other women began to soften, and even the face of Mr. Byrd betrayed that a change was on the verge of taking place in his feelings. But the coroner's look and tone dashed cold water on this young and tender growth of sympathy. Passing over to the witness the paper on which he had been scribbling, he explained with dry significance: "It's only a matter of subtraction and addition, Mr. Hildreth. You have said that upon quitting this house you went directly to the depot, where you arrived barely in time to jump on the train as it was leaving the station. Now, to walk from this place to the depot at any pace you would be likely to use would occupy, let us say, 7 minutes. At 2 minutes before 12, then, you were still in this house. Well," he ejaculated, interrupting himself as the other opened his lips, "have you anything to say?" "No," was the dejected and hesitating reply. The coroner at once resumed: "But at 5 minutes before 12, Mr. Hildreth, the tramp walked into the widow's yard. Now, allowing only 2 minutes for your interview with that lady, the conclusion remains that you were in the house when he came up to it. Yet you declare that, although you stood in full view of the yard, you did not see him. You figure closer than an astronomer calculating an eclipse," burst from the young man's lips in a flash of that resolution which had for the last few minutes animated him. "How do you know your witnesses have been so exact to a second when they say this and that on the goings and comings you are pleased to put into an arithmetical problem? A minute or two, one way or the other, would make a sad discrepancy in your calculations, Mr. Coroner." "I know it," assented Dr. Tredwell, quietly ignoring the other's heat. "But if the jury will remember, there were 4 witnesses at least who testified to the striking of the town clock just as the tramp finally issued from the lane, and 1 witness, of well-known accuracy in matters of detail, who declared on oath that she had just dropped her eyes from that same clock when she observed the tramp go into the widow's gate, and that it was 5 minutes to 12 exactly. But lest I do seem too nice in my calculations," the coroner inexorably pursued, "I will take the trouble of putting it another way. At what time did you leave the hotel, Mr. Hildreth?" "I don't know," was the testy response. "Well, I can tell you," the coroner assured him. "It was about 20 minutes to 12, or possibly earlier, but no later. My reason for saying this," he went on, drawing once more before him the fatal sheet of paper, "is that Mrs. Dayton's children next door were out playing in front of this house for some few minutes previous to the time the tramp came into the lane. As you did not see them, you must have arrived here before they began their game, and that, at the least calculation, would make the time as early as 11:45. "Well," the fierce looks of the other seemed to say, "and what if it was?" "Mr. Hildreth," continued the coroner, "if you were in this house at 11:45 and did not leave it till 2 minutes before, and the interview was, as you say, a mere interchange of a dozen words or so that could not possibly have occupied more than 3 minutes, where were you during all the rest of the time that must have elapsed after you finished your interview and the moment you left the house?" It was a knock-down question. This aristocratic-looking young gentleman, who had hitherto held himself erect before them, notwithstanding the humiliating nature of the inquiries which had been propounded to him, cringed visibly and bowed his head as if a stroke of vital force had descended upon it. Bringing his fist down on the table near which he stood, he seemed to utter a muttered curse, while the veins swelled on his forehead so powerfully that more than one person present dropped their eyes from a spectacle which bore so distinctly the stamp of guilt. "You have not answered," intimated the coroner, after a moment of silent waiting. "No," was the loud reply, uttered with a force that startled all present, and made the more timid gaze with some apprehension at his sudden antagonistic attitude. "It is not pleasant for a gentleman," he emphasized the word bitterly, "for a gentleman to acknowledge himself caught at a time like this in a decided equivocation. But you have cornered me fairly and squarely, and I am bound to tell the truth. Gentlemen, I did not leave the widow's house as immediately as I said. I stayed for fully 5 minutes or so alone in the small hall that leads to the front door. In all probability I was there when the tramp passed by on his way to the kitchen door, and there when he came back again." And Mr. Hildreth fixed his eyes on the coroner as if he dared him to push him further. But Dr. Tredwell had been in his present seat before. Merely confronting the other with that cold official gaze which seems to act like a wall of ice between a witness and the coroner, he said 2 words. "What doing?" The effect was satisfactory. Paling suddenly, Mr. Hildreth dropped his eyes and replied humbly, though with equal laconism, "I was thinking." But scarcely had the words left his lips than a fresh flame of feeling started up within him, and looking from juryman to juryman, he passionately exclaimed, "You consider that acknowledgment suspicious? You wonder why a man should give a few minutes to thought after the conclusion of an interview that terminated all hope? I wonder at it now myself. I wonder I did not go straight out of the house and rush headlong into any danger that promised an immediate extinction of my life." No language could have more forcibly betrayed the real desperation of his mind at the critical moment when the widow's life hung in the balance. He saw this perhaps when it was too late, for the sweat started on his brow, and he drew himself up like a man nerving himself to meet a blow he no longer hoped to avert. One further remark, however, left his lips. "Whatever I did, or whatever I was thinking, one thing I here declare to be true, and that is this, that I did not see the widow again after she left my side and went back to her kitchen in the rear of the house. The hand that struck her may have been lifted while I stood in the hall, but if so, I did not know it, nor can I tell you now who it was that killed her." It was the first attempt at direct disavowal which he had made, and it had its effect. The coroner softened a trifle of his austerity, and the jurymen glanced at each other relieved. But the weight of suspicion against this young man was too heavy, and his manner had been too unfortunate, for this effect to last long. Gladly as many would have been to credit this denial, if only for the name he bore and a certain fine aspect of gentlemanhood that surrounded him in spite of his present humiliation, it was no longer possible to do so without question, and he seemed to feel this and do his best to accept the situation with patience. An inquiry which was put to him at this time by a juryman showed the existent state of feeling against him. "May I ask," that individual dryly interrogated, "why you came back to Sibley after having left it?" The response came clear and full. Evidently the gravity of his position had at last awakened the latent resources of Mr. Hildreth's mind. "I heard of the death of this woman, and my surprise caused me to return." "How did you hear of it?" "Through the newspapers." "And were you surprised?" "I was astounded. I felt as if I had received a blow myself, and could not rest till I had come back where I could learn the full particulars." "So, then, it was curiosity that brought you to this inquest to day?" "It was." The juryman looked at him astonished. So did all the rest. His manner was so changed, his answers so prompt and ringing. "And what was it," broke in the coroner, "that led you to register yourself at the hotel under a false name?" "I scarcely know," was the answer, given with less fire and some show of embarrassment. Perhaps I thought that, under the circumstances, it would be better for me not to use my own." "In other words, you were afraid!" exclaimed the coroner, with the full impressiveness of his somewhat weighty voice and manner. It was a word to make the weakest of men start. Mr. Hildreth, who was conspicuous in his own neighborhood for personal if not for moral courage, flushed till it looked as if the veins would burst on his forehead, but he made no other reply than a proud and angry look and a short, "I was not aware of fear, though, to be sure, I had no premonition of the treatment I should be called upon to suffer here to-day." The flash told. The coroner sat as if doubtful, and looked from man to man of the jury as if he would question their feelings on this vital subject. Meantime, the full shame of his position settled heavier and heavier upon Mr. Hildreth. His head fell slowly forward, and he seemed to be asking himself how he was to meet the possibly impending ignominy of a direct accusation. Suddenly he drew himself erect, and a gleam shot from his eyes that, for the first time, revealed him as a man of latent pluck and courage. "Gentlemen," he began, looking first at the coroner and then at the jury, "you have not said you consider me guilty of this crime, but you evidently harbor the suspicion. I do not wonder. My own words have given me away, and any man would find it difficult to believe in my innocence after what has been testified in this place. Do not hesitate, then. The shock of finding myself suspected of a horrible murder is past. I am willing to be arrested. Indeed, after what has taken place, I am not only willing, but even anxious. I want to be tried, if only to prove to the world my complete and entire innocence." The effect of this speech, uttered at a moment so critical, may be easily imagined. All the impressible people present at once signified their belief in his honesty and gave him looks of sympathy, if not approval, while the cooler and possibly the more judicious of his auditors calmly weighed these assertions against the evidence that had been advanced, and finding the result unsatisfactory, shook their heads as if unconvinced, and waited further developments. They did not come. The inquiry had reached its climax, and little, if anything, more was left to be said. Mr. Hildreth was examined more fully, and some few of the witnesses who had been heard in the early part of the day were recalled, but no new facts came to light, and no fresh inquiries were started. Mr. Byrd, who from the attitude of the coroner could not fail to see Mr. Hildreth was looked upon with suspicion that would ultimately end in arrest, decided that his interest in the inquest was at an end, and being greatly fatigued, gave up his position at the window and quietly stole away. End of chapter 9. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. The Final Test. Men are born with two eyes, but with one tongue, in order that they should see twice as much as they say. Colton. The fact was, he wanted to think. Detective though he was, and accustomed to the bravado with which every sort of criminal will turn to meet their fate when fully driven to bay, there had been something in the final manner of this desperate but evidently cultured gentleman which had impressed him against his own will, and made him question whether the suspected man was not rather the victim of a series of extraordinary circumstances than the selfish and brutal criminal which the evidence given seemed to suggest. Not that Mr. Byrd ever allowed his generous heart to blind him to the plain language of facts. His secret and not to be smothered doubts in another direction were proof enough of this, and had it not been for those very doubts, the probabilities are that he would have agreed with the cooler headed portion of the crowd, which listened unmoved to that last indignant burst of desperate manhood. But with those doubts still holding possession of his mind, he could not feel so sure of Mr. Hildreth's guilt, and the struggle that was likely to ensue between his personal feelings on the one side and his sense of duty on the other did not promise to be so light as to make it possible for him to remain within eye and earshot of an unsympathetic crowd. If only the superintendent had not left it to my judgment to interfere, thought he, pacing the streets with ever increasing uneasiness, the responsibility would have been shifted from my shoulders, and I would have left the young man to his fate in peace. But now I would be criminally at fault if I were to let him drift hopelessly to his doom, when by a lift of my finger I might possibly turn the attention of justice toward the real culprit. Yet the making up of his mind to interfere was a torture to Horace Byrd. If he was not conscious of any love for Imogene Dare, he was sufficiently under the dominion of her extraordinary fascinations to feel that any movement on his part toward the unraveling of the mystery that enveloped her would be like subjecting his own self to the rack of public inquiry and suspicion. Nor, though he walked the streets for hours, each moment growing more and more settled in his conviction of Mr. Hildreth's innocence, could he bring himself to the point of embracing the duty presented to him, till he had subjected Miss Dare to a new test, and won for himself absolute certainty as to the fact of her possessing a clue to the crime which had not been discovered in the coroner's inquiry. The possibility of innocence on her part is even greater than on that of Mr. Hildreth, he considered, and nothing, not even the peril of those dearest to me, could justify me in shifting the weight of suspicion from a guiltless man to an equally guiltless woman. It was therefore for the purpose of solving this doubt that he finally sought Mr. Ferris, and after learning that Mr. Hildreth was under surveillance and would in all probability be subjected to arrest on the morrow, asked for some errand that would take him to Mr. Orcutt's house. "I have a great admiration for that gentleman, and would like to make his acquaintance," he remarked carelessly, hiding his true purpose under his usual nonchalant tones. "But I do not want to seem to be pushing myself forward. So if you could give me some papers to carry to him, or some message requiring an introduction to his presence, I should feel very much obliged." Mr. Ferris, who had no suspicions of his own to assist him in understanding the motives that led to this request, easily provided the detective with the errand he sought. Mr. Byrd at once started for the lawyer's house. It was fully 2 miles away, but once arrived there he was thankful that the walk had been so long, as the fatigue following upon the activity of the afternoon had succeeded in quieting his pulses and calming down the fierce excitement which had held him under its control ever since he had taken the determination to satisfy his doubts by an interview with Miss Dare. Ringing the bell of the rambling old mansion that spread out its wide extensions through the vines and bushes of an old-fashioned and most luxuriant garden, he waited the issue with beating heart. A respectable-looking negro servant came to the door. "Is Mr. Orcutt in?" he asked. "Or if not, Miss Dare, I have a message from Mr. Ferris, and would be glad to see one of them." This in order to ascertain at a word if the lady was at home. "Miss Dare is not in," was the civil response, "and Mr. Orcutt is very busily engaged. But if you will step into the parlor, I will tell him you are here." "No," returned the disappointed detective, handing her the note he held in his hand. "If your master is busy, I will not disturb him." And, turning away, he went slowly down the steps. "If I only knew where she was gone," he muttered bitterly. But he did not consider himself in a position to ask. Inwardly chafing over his ill luck, Mr. Byrd proceeded with reluctant pace to regain the street, when, hearing the gate suddenly click, he looked up and saw advancing toward him a young gentleman of a peculiarly spruce and elegant appearance. "Ha, another visitor for Miss Dare," was the detective's natural inference, and with a sudden movement he withdrew from the path and paused as if to light his cigar in the shadow of the thick bushes that grew against the house. In an instant the young stranger was on the stoop. Another, and he had rung the bell, which was answered almost as soon as his hand dropped from the knob. "Is Miss Dare in?" was the inquiry, uttered in loud and cheery tones. "No, sir. She is spending a few days with Miss Tremaine," was the clear and satisfactory reply. "Shall I tell her you have been here?" "No, I will call myself at Miss Tremaine's," rejoined the gentleman, and with a gay swing of his cane and a cheerful look overhead where the stars were already becoming visible, he sauntered easily off, followed by the envious thoughts of Mr. Byrd. "Miss Tremaine," repeated the latter musingly. "Who knows Miss Tremaine?" While he was asking himself this question, the voice of the young man rose melodiously in a scrap of old song, and instantly Mr. Byrd recognized in the seeming stranger the well-known tenor singer from the church he had himself attended the Sunday before, a gentleman, too, to whom he had been introduced by Mr. Ferris, and with whom he had exchanged something more than the passing civilities of the moment. To increase his pace, overtake the young man, recall himself to his attention, and join him in his quick walk down the street was the work of a moment. The natural sequence followed. Mr. Byrd made himself so agreeable that by the time they arrived at Miss Tremaine's the other felt loath to part with him, and it resulted in his being urged to join this chance acquaintance in his call. Nothing could have pleased Mr. Byrd better, so waiving for once his instinctive objection to any sort of personal intrusion, he signified his acquiescence to the proposal and at once accompanied his new friend into the house of the unknown Miss Tremaine. He found it lit up as for guests. All the rooms on the ground floor were open, and in one of them he could discern a dashing and coquettish young miss holding court over a cluster of eager swains. "Ah, I forgot!" exclaimed Mr. Byrd's companion, whose name, by the way, was Duryea. "It's Miss Tremaine's reception night. She is the daughter of one of the professors of the high school," he went on, whispering his somewhat late explanations into the ear of Mr. Byrd. "Every Thursday evening she throws her house open for callers, and the youth of the academy are only too eager to avail themselves of the opportunity of coming here. Well, it is all the better for us. Miss Dare despises boys, and in all likelihood we shall have her entirely to ourselves." A quick pang contracted the breast of Mr. Byrd. If this easy, almost rakish fellow at his side but knew the hideous errand which brought him to this house, what a scene would have ensued! But he had no time for reflection, or even for that irresistible shrinking from his own designs which he now began to experience. Before he realized that he was fully committed to this venture, he found himself in the parlor, bowing before the naive and laughing-eyed Miss Tremaine, who rose to receive him with all the airy graciousness of a finished coquette. Miss Dare was not visible, and Mr. Byrd was just wondering if he would be called upon to enter into a sustained conversation with his pretty hostess, when a deep, rich voice was heard in the adjoining room, and looking up, he saw the stately figure he so longed and yet dreaded to encounter advancing toward them through the open door. She was very pale, and, to Mr. Byrd's eyes, looked thoroughly worn out, if not ill. Yet she bore herself with a steadiness that was evidently the result of her will, and manifested neither reluctance nor impatience when the eager Mr. Duryea pressed forward with his compliments, though from the fixedness of her gaze and the immobility of her lip, Mr. Byrd too truly discovered that her thoughts were far away from the scene of mirth and pleasure in which she found herself. "You see I have presumed to follow you, Miss Dare," was the greeting with which Mr. Duryea hailed her approach, and he immediately became so engrossed with his gallantries that he forgot to introduce his companion. Mr. Byrd was rather relieved at this. He was not yet ready to submit her to the test he considered necessary to a proper understanding of the situation, and he had not the heart to approach her with any mere civility on his tongue, while matters of such vital importance to her happiness, if not to her honor, trembled in the balance. He preferred to talk to Miss Tremaine, and this he continued to do till the young fellows at his side, one by one, edged away, leaving no one in that portion of the room but himself and Miss Tremaine, Mr. Duryea, and Miss Dare. The latter two stood together some few feet behind him, and were discussing in a somewhat languid way the merits of a musicale which they had lately attended. They were approaching, however, and he felt that if he did not speak at once he might not have another opportunity for doing so during the whole evening. Turning, therefore, to Miss Tremaine with more seriousness than her gay and totally inconsequent conversation had hitherto allowed, he asked in what he meant to be a simply colloquial and courteous manner if she had heard the news. "News?" she repeated. "No. Is there any news?" "Yes, I call it news, but perhaps you are not interested in the murder that has lately taken place in this town." "Oh, yes, I am!" she exclaimed, all eagerness at once, while he felt rather than perceived that the couple at his back stood suddenly still, as if his words had worked their spell over one heart there at least. "Papa knew Mrs. Clemmens very well," the little lady proceeded with a bewitchingly earnest look. "Have they found their murderer, do you think? Anything less than that would be no news to me." "There is every reason to suppose," he began, and stopped, something in the deadly silence behind him making it impossible for him to proceed. Happily he was not obliged to. An interruption occurred in the shape of a newcomer, and he was left with that fatal last word on his lips to await the approach of that severely measured step behind him, which by this time he knew was bringing the inscrutable Miss Dare to his side. "Miss Dare, allow me to present to you Mr. Byrd. Mr. Byrd, Miss Dare." The young detective bowed. With rigid attention to forms of etiquette, he uttered the first few acknowledgments necessary to the occasion, and then glanced up. She was looking him full in the face. "We have met before," he was about to observe, but not detecting the least sign of recognition in her gaze, restrained the words and hastily dropped his eyes. "Mr. Duryea informs me you are a stranger in town," she remarked, moving slowly to one side in a way to rid herself of that gentleman's too immediate presence. "Have you a liking for the place, or do you meditate any lengthy stay?" "No, that is," he rejoined, somewhat shaken in his theories by the self-possession of her tone and the ease and quietness with which she evidently prepared to enter into a sustained conversation. "I may go away to morrow, and I may linger on for an indefinite length of time. It all depends upon certain matters which will be determined for me to night. Sibley is a very pretty place," he observed, startled at his own temerity in venturing the last remark. "Yes." The word came as if forced, and she looked at Mr. Duryea. "Do you wish anything, Miss Dare?" that gentleman suddenly asked. "You do not look well." "I am not well," she acknowledged. "No, thank you," she cried, as he pushed a chair toward her. "It is too warm here. If you do not object, we will go into the other room." And with a courteous glance that included both gentlemen in its invitation, she led the way into the adjoining apartment. Could it have been with the purpose of ridding herself of the assiduities of Mr. Duryea? The room contained half a dozen or more musical people, and no sooner did they perceive their favorite tenor approach than they seized upon him, and without listening to his excuses, carried him off to the piano, leaving Miss Dare alone with Mr. Byrd. She seemed instantly to forget her indisposition. Drawing herself up till every queenly attribute she possessed flashed brilliantly before his eyes, she asked, with sudden determination, if she had been right in understanding him to say that there was news in regard to the murder of Mrs. Clemmens. Subduing by a strong inward effort every token of emotion which her own introduction of this topic naturally evoked, he replied in his easiest tones: "Yes, there was an inquest held to day, and the authorities evidently think they have discovered the person who killed her." And obliging himself to meet halfway the fate that awaited him, he bestowed upon the lady before him a casual glance that hid beneath its easy politeness the greatest anxiety of his life. The test worked well. From the pallor of sickness, grief, or apprehension, her complexion whitened to the deadlier hue of mortal terror. Impossible, her lips seemed to breathe, and Mr. Byrd could almost fancy he saw the hair rise on her forehead. Cursing in his heart the bitter necessity that had forced him into this duty, he was about to address her in a way calculated to break the spell occasioned by his last words, when the rich and tuneful voice of the melodious singer rose suddenly on the air, and they heard the words, "Come rest in this bosom, my own stricken dear. Though the herd have fled from thee, thy home is still here. Here still is the smile that no cloud can overcast, and a heart and a hand all thy own to the last." Instantly Mr. Byrd perceived that he should not be obliged to speak, though the music, or possibly the words, struck her like a blow. It likewise served to recall her to herself. Dropping her gaze, which had remained fixed upon his own, she turned her face aside, saying with forced composure, "This near contact with crime is dreadful." Then slowly, and with a quietness that showed how great was her power of self-control when she was not under the influence of surprise, she inquired, "And who do they think this person is? What name do they presume to associate with the murder of this woman?" With something of the feeling of a surgeon who nerves himself to bury the steel in his patient's quivering flesh, he gave his response unhesitatingly. "A gentleman's, I believe, a young man connected with her in some strange way by financial interests, a Mr. Hildreth of Toledo, Gouverneur Hildreth, I think they call him." It was not the name she expected. He saw this by the relaxation that took place in all her features, by the look of almost painful relief that flashed for a moment into the eyes she turned like lightning upon him. "Gouverneur Hildreth," she repeated, and he knew from the tone that it was not only a different name from what she anticipated, but that it was also a strange one to her. "I never heard of such a person," she went on, after a minute, during which the relentless mellow voice of the unconscious singer filled the room with the passionate appeal, "Oh, what was love made for, if 'tis not the same, through joy and through sorrow, through glory and shame?" "That is not strange," explained Mr. Byrd, drawing nearer, as if to escape the pursuing sweetness of the incongruous song. "He is not known in this town. He only came here the morning the unfortunate woman was murdered. Whether he really killed her or not," he proceeded, with forced quietness, "no one can tell, of course, but the facts are very much against him, and the poor fellow is under arrest." "What?" The word was involuntary. So was the tone of horrified surprise in which it was uttered. But the music, now swelling to a crescendo, drowned both word and tone, or so she seemed to fondly imagine, for making another effort at self-control, she confined herself to a quiet repetition of his words, "Under arrest," and then waited with only a suitable display of emotion for whatever further enlightenment he chose to give her. He mercifully spoke to the point. "Yes, under arrest. You see, he was in the house at or near the time the deadly blow was struck. He was in the front hall, he says, and nowhere near the woman or her unknown assailant. But there is no evidence against any one else, and the facts so far proved show he had an interest in her death, and so he has to pay the penalty of circumstances. And he may be guilty, who knows?" the young detective pursued, seeing she was struck with horror and dismay. Dreadful as it is to imagine that a gentleman of culture and breeding could be brought to commit such a deed. But she seemed to have ears for but one phrase of all this. "He was in the front hall," she repeated. "How did he get there? What called him there?" "He had been visiting the widow, and was on his way out. He paused to collect his thoughts," he said. "It seemed unaccountable, Miss Dare, but the whole thing is strange and very mysterious." She was deaf to his explanations. "Do you suppose he heard the widow scream?" she asked, trembling. "Or—" A sinking of ringing tones whose powerful vibration had made this conversation possible caused her to pause. When the notes grew loud enough again for her to proceed, she seemed to have forgotten the question she was about to propound, and simply inquired, "Had he anything to say about what he overheard or saw?" "No, if he spoke the truth, and stood in the hall, as he said. The sounds, if sounds there were, stopped short of the sitting-room door, for he has nothing to say about them." A change passed over Miss Dare. She dropped her eyes, and an instant's pause followed this last acknowledgment. "Will you tell me," she inquired, at last, speaking very slowly, in an attempt to infuse into her voice no more than a natural tone of interest, "how it was he came to say he stood in that place during the assault?" "He did not say he stood in that place during the assault," was again the forced rejoinder of Mr. Byrd. "It was by means of a nice calculation of time and events that it was found he must have been in the house at or near the fatal moment." Another pause, another bar of that lovely music. "And he is a gentleman, you say?" was her hurried remark at last. "Yes, and a very handsome one." "And they have put him in prison?" "Yes, or will on the morrow." She turned and leaned against a window frame near by, looking with eyes that saw nothing into the still vast night. "I suppose he has friends," she faintly suggested. "Two sisters, if no one nearer and dearer." "Thou hast called me thy angel in moments of bliss, and thy angel I'll be 'mid the horrors of this. Through the furnace unshrinking thy steps to pursue, and shield thee and save thee, or perish there too," rang the mellow song. "I am not well," she suddenly cried, leaving the window and turning quickly toward Mr. Byrd. "I am much obliged to you," said she, lowering her voice to a whisper, for the last note of the song was dying away in a quivering pianissimo. "I have been deeply interested in this tragedy, and am thankful for any information in regard to it. I must now bid you good evening." And with a stately bow into which she had fused the mingled courtesy and haughtiness of her nature, she walked steadily away through the crowd that vainly sought to stay her, and disappeared, almost without a pause, behind the door that opened into the hall. Mr. Byrd remained a full half hour after that, but he could never tell what he did, or with whom he conversed, or how and when he issued from the house and made his way back to his room in the hotel. He only knew that at midnight he was still walking the floor, and had not yet made up his mind to take the step which his own sense of duty now inexorably demanded. Chapter 11. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Decision. Who dares to say that he alone has found the truth? Longfellow. The next morning Mr. Ferris was startled by the appearance in his office of Mr. Byrd, looking wretchedly anxious and ill. "I have come," said the detective, "to ask you what you think of Mr. Hildreth's prospects. Have you made up your mind to have him arrested for this crime?" "Yes," was the reply. "The evidence against him is purely circumstantial, but it is very strong, and if no fresh developments occur, I think there can be no doubt about my duty. Each and every fact that comes to light only strengthens the case against him. When he came to be examined last night, a ring was found on his person which he acknowledged to having worn on the day of the murder." "He took it off during the inquest," murmured Mr. Byrd. "I saw him." "It is said by Hickory, the somewhat questionable cognomen of your fellow detective from New York, that the young man manifested the most intense uneasiness during the whole inquiry; that, in fact, his attention was first drawn to him by the many tokens of which he gave of suppressed agitation and alarm. Indeed, Mr. Hickory at one time thought he should be obliged to speak to this stranger in order to prevent a scene. Once Mr. Hildreth got up as if to go, and indeed, if he had been less hemmed in by the crowd, there is every reason to believe he would have attempted an escape." "Is Hickory a man of good judgment?" inquired Mr. Byrd anxiously. "Why, yes, I should say so. He seems to understand his business. The way he procured us the testimony of Mr. Hildreth was certainly satisfactory." "I wish that, without his knowing it, I could hear him give his opinion of this matter," intimated the other. "Well, you can," rejoined Mr. Ferris, after a quick and comprehensive survey of Mr. Byrd's countenance. "I am expecting him here any moment, and if you see fit to sit down behind that screen, you can, without the least difficulty to yourself or him, hear all he has to impart." "I will, then," the detective declared, a gloomy frown suddenly corrugating his brow, and he stepped across to the screen which had been indicated to him and quietly withdrew from view. He had scarcely done this when a short, quick step was heard at the door, and a wide-awake voice called out, cheerily, "Are you alone, sir?" "Ah!" ejaculated Mr. Ferris. "Come in, come in. I have been awaiting you for some minutes," he declared, ignoring the look which the man threw hastily around the room. "Any news this morning?" "No," returned the other in a tone of complete self-satisfaction. "We've caged the bird, and mustn't expect much more in the way of news. I'm on my way to Albany now to pick up such facts about him as may be lying around there loose, and shall be ready to start for Toledo any day next week that you may think proper." "You are, then, convinced that Mr. Hildreth is undeniably the guilty party in this case?" exclaimed the District Attorney, taking a whiff at his cigar. "Convinced? That is a strong word, sir. A detective is never convinced," protested the man. "He leaves that for the judge and jury. But if you ask me if there is any doubt about the direction in which all the circumstantial evidence in this case points, I must retort by asking you for a clue, or the tag end of a clue, guiding me elsewhere. I know," he went on, with the volubility of a man whose work is done, and who feels he has the right to a momentary indulgence in conversation, "that it is not an agreeable thing to subject a gentleman like Mr. Hildreth to the shame of a public arrest. But facts are not partial, sir, and the gentleman has no more rights in law than the coarsest fellow that we take up for butchering his mother. But you know all this without my telling you, and I only mention it to excuse any obstinacy I may have manifested on the subject. He is mightily cut up about it," he again proceeded, as he found Mr. Ferris forbore to reply. "I am told he didn't sleep a wink all night, but spent his time alternately in pacing the floor like a caged lion, and in a wild sort of stupor that had something of the hint of madness in it. If my grandfather had only known, was the burden of his song, and when one approached him, he either told them to keep their eyes off him, or else buried his face in his hands with an entreaty for them not to disturb the last hours of a dying man. He evidently has no hope of escaping the indignity of arrest, and as soon as it was light enough for him to see, he asked for paper and pencil. They were brought him, and a man stood over him while he wrote. It proved to be a letter to his sisters enjoining them to believe in his innocence, and wound up with what was very much like an attempt at a will, although it looks as if he meditated suicide, and we have been careful to take from him every possible means of his effecting his release in this way, as well as set a strict though secret watch upon him." A slight noise took place behind the screen, which at any other time Mr. Hickory would have been the first to notice and inquire into. As it was, it had only the effect of unconsciously severing his train of thought and starting him alertly to his feet. "Well," he said, facing the District Attorney with a cheerful vivacity, "any orders?" "No," responded Mr. Ferris. "A run down to Albany seems to be the best thing for you at present. On your return we will consult again." "Very well, sir. I shall not be absent more than 2 days, and in the meantime you will let me know if anything important occurs." And handing over his new address, Hickory speedily took his leave. "Well, Mr. Byrd, what do you think of him?" For reply, Mr. Byrd stepped forth and took his stand before the District Attorney. "Has Coroner Tredwell informed you," said he, "that the superintendent has left it to my discretion to interfere in this matter if I thought that by doing so I could further the ends of justice?" "Yes," was the language of the quick, short nod he received. "Very well," continued the other. "You will pardon me, then, if I ask you to convey to Mr. Hildreth the following message: that if he is guiltless of this crime, he need have no fear of the results of the arrest to which he may be subjected; that a man has interested himself in this matter who pledges his word not to rest till he has discovered the guilty party and freed the innocent from suspicion." "What?" cried Mr. Ferris, astonished at the severe but determined bearing of the young man who, up to this time, he had only seen under his lighter and more indifferent aspect. "You don't agree with this fellow, then, in his conclusions regarding Mr. Hildreth?" "No, sir. Hickory, as I judge, is an egotist. He discovered Mr. Hildreth and brought him to the notice of the jury. Therefore, Mr. Hildreth is guilty." "And you?" "I am open to doubt about it. Not that I would acknowledge it to any one but you, sir." "Why?" "Because if I work in this case at all, or make any effort to follow up the clue which I believe myself to have received, it must be done secretly and without raising the suspicion of any one in this town. I am not in a position, as you know, to work openly, even if it were advisable to do so, which it certainly is not. What I do must be accomplished under cover, and I ask you to help me in my self-imposed and by no means agreeable task by trusting me to pursue my inquiries alone, until such time as I assure myself beyond a doubt that my own convictions are just, and that the man who murdered Mrs. Clemmens is some one entirely separated from Mr. Hildreth and any interests that he represents." "You are, then, going to take up this case?" The answer given was short, but it meant the deliberate shivering of the faintest dream of love that had ever visited Mr. Byrd's imagination. "I am." End of chapter 11. End of book 1. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, The Spider. Chapter 12, The Weaving of a Web. Thus far we run before the wind. In the interview which Mr. Byrd had held with Miss Dare, he had been conscious of omitting one test which many another man in his place would have made. This was the utterance of the name of him whom he really believed to be the murderer of Mrs. Clemmens. Had he spoken this name, had he allowed himself to breathe the words Craik Mansell into the ears of this agitated woman, or even gone so far as to allude in the most careless way to the widow's nephew, he felt sure his daring would have been rewarded by some expression on her part that would have given him a substantial basis for his theories to rest upon. But he had too much natural chivalry for this. His feelings as a man got in the way of his instinct as a detective. Nevertheless, he felt positive that his suspicions in regard to this nephew of Mrs. Clemmens were correct, and set about the task of fitting the facts to his theory with all that settled and dogged determination which follows the pursuit of a stern duty unwillingly embraced. 2 points required instant settling. First, the truth or falsehood of his supposition as to the identification of the person confronted by Miss Dare in the Syracuse depot with the young man described by Miss Firman as the nephew of Widow Clemmens. Secondly, the existence or non-existence of proof going to show the presence of this person at or near the house of Mrs. Clemmens during the time of the assault. But before proceeding to satisfy himself in regard to these essentials, he went again to the widow's house, and there spent an hour in a careful study of its inner and outer arrangements, with a view to the formation of a complete theory as to the manner and method of the murder. He found that in default of believing Mr. Hildreth the assailant, one supposition was positively necessary, and this was that the murderer was in the house when this gentleman came to it. A glance at the diagram on the next page will explain why. The house, as you will see, has but 3 entrances: the front door, at which Mr. Hildreth unconsciously stood guard; the kitchen door, also unconsciously guarded during the critical moment by the coming and going of the tramp through the yard; and the dining room door, which, though all to appearances free from the surveillance of any eye, was so situated in reference to the clock at which the widow stood when attacked, that it was manifestly impossible for any one to enter it and cross the room to the hearth without attracting the attention of her eye, if not her ear. To be sure, there was the bare possibility of his having come in by the kitchen door after the departure of the tramp, but such a contingency was scarcely worth considering. The almost certain conclusion was that he had been in the house for some time, and was either in the dining room when Mrs. Clemmens returned to it from her interview with Mr. Hildreth, or else came down to it from the floor above by means of the staircase that so strangely descended into that very room. Another point looked equally clear: the escape of the murderer, still in default of considering Mr. Hildreth as such, must have been by means of one of the back doors, and must have been in the direction of the woods. To be sure, there was a stretch of uneven and marshy ground to be travelled over before the shelter of the trees could be reached, but a person driven by fear could, at a pinch, travel it in 5 minutes or less, and a momentary calculation on the part of Mr. Byrd sufficed to show him that more time than this had elapsed from the probable instant of assault to the moment when Mr. Ferris opened the side door and looked out upon the swamp. The dearth of dwellings on the left-hand side of the street, and consequently the comparative immunity from observation which was given to that portion of the house which overlooked the swamp, made him conclude that this outlet from the dining room had been the one made use of in the murderer's flight. A glance down the yard to the broken fence that separated the widow's land from the boggy fields beyond only tended to increase the probabilities of this supposition, and, alert to gain for himself that full knowledge of the situation necessary to a successful conduct of this mysterious affair, he hastily left the house and started across the swamp, with the idea of penetrating the woods and discovering for himself what opportunity they afforded for concealment or escape. He had more difficulty in doing this than he expected. The ground about the hillocks was half sunk in water, and the least slip to one side invariably precipitated him among the brambles that encumbered this spot. Still he compassed his task in little more than 5 minutes, arriving at the firm ground and its sturdy growth of beeches and maples, well covered with mud, but so far thoroughly satisfied with the result of his efforts. The next thing to be done was to search the woods, not for the purpose of picking up clues, it was too late for that, but to determine what sort of a refuge they afforded, and whether, in the event of a man's desiring to penetrate them quickly, many impediments would arise in the shape of tangled underground or loose-lying stones. He found them remarkably clear, so much so indeed that he travelled for some distance into their midst before he realized that he had passed beyond their borders. More than this, he came ere long upon something like a path, and, following it, emerged into a sort of glade, where, backed up against a high rock, stood a small and seemingly deserted hut. It was the first object he had met with that in any way suggested the possible presence of man, and advancing to it with cautious steps, he looked into its open doorway. Nothing met his eye but an empty interior, and without pausing to bestow upon the building a further thought, he hurried on through a path he saw opening beyond it, till he came to the end of the wood. Stepping forth, he paused in astonishment. Instead of having penetrated the woods in a direct line, he found that he had merely described a half circle through them, and now stood on a highway leading directly back into the town. Likewise, he was in full sight of the terminus of a line of horse cars that connected this remote region of Sibley with its business portion, and though distant a good mile from the railway depot, was to all intents and purposes as near the means of escape as he would have been in the street in front of Widow Clemmens' house. Full of thoughts and inly wondering over the fatality that had confined the attention of the authorities to the approach afforded by the lane, to the utter exclusion of this more circuitous but certainly more elusive road of escape, he entered upon the highway and proceeded to gain the horse car he saw standing at the head of the road a few rods away. As he did so, he for the first time realized just where he was. The elegant villa of Professor Darling, rising before him on the ridge that ran along on the right-hand side of the road, made it at once evident that he was on the borders of that choice and aristocratic quarter known as the West Side. It was a new region to him, and pausing for a moment, he cast his eyes over the scene which lay stretched out before him. He had frequently heard it said that the view commanded by the houses on the ridge was the finest in the town, and he was not disappointed in it. As he looked across the verdant basin of marshy ground around which the road curved like a horseshoe, he could see the city spread out like a map before him. So unobstructed, indeed, was the view he had of its various streets and buildings, that he thought he could even detect, amid the taller and more conspicuous dwellings, the humble walls and newly shingled roof of the widow's cottage. But he could not be sure of this. His eyesight was anything but trustworthy for long distances, and hurrying forward to the car, he took his seat just as it was about to start. It carried him straight into town, and came to a standstill not 10 feet from the railroad depot. As he left it and betook himself back to his hotel, he gave to his thoughts a distinct though inward expression. If, he mused, my suppositions in regard to this matter are true, and another man than Mr. Hildreth struck the fatal blow, then I have just travelled over the self-same route he took in his flight. But were his suppositions true? It remained for him to determine. End of chapter 12. And 13 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Fly. Like, but oh, how different. Wordsworth. The paper mill of Harrison, Goodman, and Chamberlain was situated in one of the main thoroughfares of Buffalo. It was a large but otherwise unpretentious building, and gave employment to a vast number of operatives, mostly female. Some of these latter might have been surprised and possibly a little fluttered one evening at seeing a well-dressed young gentleman standing at the gate as they came forth, gazing with languid interest from one face to another as if he were on the lookout for some one of their number. But they would have been yet more astonished could they have seen him still lingering after the last one had passed, watching with unabated patience the opening and shutting of the small side door devoted to the use of the firm and such employees as had seats in the office. It was Mr. Byrd, and his purpose there at this time of day was to see and review the whole rank and file of the young men employed in the place, in the hope of being able to identify the nephew of Mrs. Clemmens by his supposed resemblance to the person whose character of face and form had been so minutely described to him. For Mr. Byrd was a just man and a thoughtful one, and knowing this identification to be the keystone of his lately formed theory, desired it to be complete and of no doubtful character. He accordingly held fast to his position, watching and waiting, seemingly in vain, for the dark, powerful face and the sturdily built frame of the gentleman whose likeness he had attempted to draw in conjunction with that of Miss Dare. But though he saw many men of all sorts and kinds issue from one door or another of this vast building, not one of them struck him with that sudden and unmistakable sense of familiarity which he had a right to expect, and he was just beginning to doubt if the whole framework of his elaborately formed theory was not destined to fall into ruins, when the small door already alluded to opened once more and a couple of gentlemen came out. The appearance of one of them gave Mr. Byrd a start. He was young, powerfully built, wore a large mustache, and had a complexion of unusual swarthiness. There was character, too, in his face, though not so much as Mr. Byrd had expected to see in the nephew of Mrs. Clemmens. Still, people differ about degrees of expression, and to his informant this face might have appeared strong. He was dressed in a business suit and was without an overcoat, two facts that made it difficult for Mr. Byrd to get any assistance from the cut and color of his clothes. But there was enough in the general style and bearing of this person to make Mr. Byrd anxious to know his name. He therefore took it upon himself to follow him, a proceeding which brought him to the corner just in time to see the two gentlemen separate, and the especial one in whom he was interested step into a car. He succeeded in getting a seat in the same car, and for some blocks had the pleasure of watching the back of the supposed Mansell as he stood on the front platform with the driver. Then others got in, and the detective's view was obstructed, and presently, he never could tell how it was, he lost track of the person he was shadowing. And when the chance came for another sight of the driver and platform, the young man was gone. Annoyed beyond expression, Mr. Byrd went to a hotel, and next day sent to the mill and procured the address of Mr. Mansell. Going to the place named, he found it to be a very respectable boarding house, and chancing upon a time when more or less of the rooms were empty, succeeded in procuring for himself an apartment there. So here he was, a fixture in the house supposed by him to hold the murderer of Mrs. Clemmens. When the time for dinner came, and with it an opportunity for settling the vexed question of Mr. Mansell's identity, not only with the man in the Syracuse depot, but with the person who had eluded his pursuit the day before, something of the excitement of the hunter in view of his game seized upon this hitherto imperturbable detective, and it was with difficulty he could sustain his usual role of fashionable indifference. He arrived at the table before any of the other boarders, and presently a goodly array of amiable matrons, old and young gentlemen, and pretty girls came filing into the room, and finally, yes, finally, the gentleman whom he had followed from the mill the day before, and whom he now had no hesitation in fixing upon as Mr. Mansell. But the satisfaction occasioned by the settlement of this perplexing question was dampened somewhat by a sudden and uneasy sense of being himself at a disadvantage. Why he should feel thus he did not know. Perhaps the almost imperceptible change which took place in that gentleman's face as their eyes first met may have caused the unlooked-for sensation, though why Mr. Mansell should change at the sight of one who must have been a perfect stranger to him was more than Mr. Byrd could understand. It was enough that the latter felt he had made a mistake in not having donned the disguise before entering this house, and that, oppressed by the idea, he withdrew his attention from the man he had come to watch and fixed it upon more immediate and personal matters. The meal was half over. Mr. Byrd, who, as a stranger of more than ordinary good looks and prepossessing manners, had been placed by the obliging landlady between her own daughter and a lady of doubtful attractions, was endeavoring to improve his advantages and make himself as agreeable as possible to both of his neighbors, when he heard a lady near him say aloud, "You are late, Mr. Mansell," and looking up, in his amazement he saw, entering the door, well, in the presence of the real owner of this name, he wondered he could ever have fixed upon the other man as the original of the person that had been described to him. The strong face, the somber expression, the Herculean frame were unique, and in the comparison which they inevitably called forth, made all other men in the room look dwarfed, if not actually commonplace. Greatly surprised at this new turn of affairs, and satisfied that he at last had before him the man who had confronted Miss Dare in the Syracuse depot, he turned his attention back to the ladies. He, however, took care to keep one ear open on the side of the newcomer, in hope of gleaning from his style and manner of conversation some notion of his disposition and nature. But Craig Mansell was at no time a talkative man, and at this especial period of his career was less inclined than ever to enter into the trivial debates or good-natured repartee that was the staple of conversation at Mrs. Hart's table. So Mr. Byrd's wishes in this regard were foiled. He succeeded, however, in assuring himself by a square look into the other's face that to whatever temptation this man may have succumbed, or whatever crime he may have been guilty, he was by nature neither cold, cruel, nor treacherous, and that the deadly blow, if dealt by him, was the offspring of some sudden impulse or violent ebullition of temper, and was being repented of with every breath he drew. But this discovery, though it modified Mr. Byrd's own sense of personal revolt against the man, could not influence him in the discharge of his duty, which was to save another of less interesting and perhaps less valuable traits of character from the consequences of a crime he had never committed. It was, therefore, no more than just that upon withdrawing from the table he should endeavor to put himself in the way of settling that second question, upon whose answer in the affirmative depended the rightful establishment of his secret suspicions. That was, whether this man was at or near the house of his aunt at the time when she was assaulted. Mrs. Hart's parlors were always thrown open to her boarders in the evening. There, at any time from 7 to 10, you might meet a merry crowd of young people intent upon enjoying themselves, and usually highly successful in their endeavors to do so. Into this throng Mr. Byrd accordingly insinuated himself, and being of the sort to win instant social recognition, soon found that he had but to make his choice in order to win for himself that tete-a-tete conversation from which he hoped so much. He consequently surveyed the company with a critical eye, and soon made up his mind as to which lady was the most affable in her manners and the least likely to meet his advances with haughty reserve, and having won an introduction to her, sat down at her side with the stern determination of making her talk about Mr. Mansell. "You have a very charming company here," he remarked. "The house seems to be filled with a most cheerful class of people." "Yes," was the not unlooked for reply. "We are all merry enough, if we except Mr. Mansell. But, of course, there is excuse for him. No one expects him to join in our sports." "Mr. Mansell? The gentleman who came in late for supper?" repeated Mr. Byrd, with no suggestion of the secret satisfaction he felt at the immediate success of his scheme. "Yes, he is in great trouble, you know. Is the nephew of the woman who was killed a few days ago at Sibley. Don't you remember? The widow lady who was struck on the head by a man of the name of Hildreth, and who died after uttering something about a ring, supposed by many to be an attempt on her part to describe the murderer?" "Yes," was the slow, almost languid response. "And a dreadful thing, too, quite horrifying in its nature. And so this Mr. Mansell is her nephew," he suggestively repeated. "Odd. I suppose he has told you all about the affair?" "He? Mercy! I don't suppose you could get him to say anything about it to save your life. He isn't of the talking sort. Besides, I don't believe he knows any more about it than you or I. He hasn't been to Sibley." "Didn't he go to the funeral?" "No, he said he was too ill, and indeed he was shut up one whole day with a terrible sore throat. He is the heir, too, of all her savings, they say. But he won't go to Sibley. Some folks think it's queer, but I—" Here her eyes wandered, and her almost serious look vanished in a somewhat coquettish smile. Following her gaze with his own, Mr. Byrd perceived a gentleman approaching. It was the one he had first taken for Mr. Mansell. "Beg pardon," was the somewhat abrupt salutation with which this person advanced, "but they are proposing a game in the next room, and Miss Clayton's assistance is considered absolutely indispensable." "Mr. Brown, first allow me to make you acquainted with Mr. Byrd," said the light-hearted damsel, with a gracious inclination. "As you are both strangers, it is well for you to know each other, especially as I expect you to join in our games." "Thank you," protested Mr. Brown, "but I don't play games." Then, seeing the deep bow of acquiescence which Mr. Byrd was making, added, with what appeared to be a touch of jealousy, "except under strong provocation," and holding out his arm, offered to escort the young lady into the next room. With an apologetic glance at Mr. Byrd, she accepted the attention proffered her, and speedily vanished into the midst of the laughing group that awaited her. Mr. Byrd found himself alone. Check number 1, thought he, and he bestowed anything but an amiable benediction upon the man who had interrupted him in the midst of so promising a conversation. His next move was in the direction of the landlady's daughter, who, being somewhat shy, favored a retired nook behind the piano. They had been neighbors at the table, and he could at once address her without fear of seeming obtrusive. "I do not see here the dark young gentleman whom you call Mr. Mansell," he remarked inquiringly. "Oh, no, he is in trouble. A near relative of his was murdered in cold blood the other day, and under the most aggravating circumstances. Haven't you heard about it? She was a Mrs. Clemmens, and lived in Sibley. It was in all the papers." "Ah, yes, I remember about it very well. And so he is her nephew," he went on, recklessly repeating himself in his determination to elicit all he could from these young and thoughtless misses. "A peculiar-looking young man, has the air of thoroughly understanding himself." "Yes, he is very smart, they say." "Does he never talk?" "Oh, yes, that is, he used to, but since his aunt's death we don't expect it. He is very much interested in machinery, and has invented something—" "Oh, Clara, you're not going to sit here," interposed the reproachful voice of a saucy-eyed maiden, who at this moment peeped around the corner of the piano. "We want all the recruits we can get," she cried, with a sudden blush, as she encountered the glance of Mr. Byrd. "Do come, and bring the gentlemen too." And she slipped away to join that very Mr. Brown, who by his importunities had been the occasion of the former interruption from which Mr. Byrd had suffered. "That man and I will quarrel yet," was the mental exclamation with which the detective rose. "Shall we join your friends?" asked he, assuming an unconcern he was far from feeling. "Yes, if you please," was the somewhat timid, though evidently pleased, reply. And Mr. Byrd noted down in his own mind check number 2. The game was a protracted one. Twice did he think to escape from the merry crowd he had entered, and twice did he fail to do so. The indefatigable Brown would not let him slip, and it was only by a positive exertion of his will that he finally succeeded in withdrawing himself. "I wish to have a word with your mother," he explained, in reply to the look of protest with which Miss Hart honored his departure. "I hear she retires early, so you will excuse me if I leave somewhat abruptly." And to Mrs. Hart's apartment he at once proceeded, and by dint of his easy assurance soon succeeded in leading her, as he had already done the rest, into a discussion of the one topic for which he had an interest. He had not time, however, to glean much from her, for just as she was making the admission that Mr. Mansell had not been home at the time of the murder, a knock was heard at the door, and with an affable bow and a short, quick stare of surprise at Mr. Byrd, the ubiquitous Mr. Brown stepped in and took a seat on the sofa, with every appearance of intending to make a call. At this third check Mr. Byrd was more than annoyed. Rising, however, with the most amiable courtesy, He bowed his acknowledgments to the landlady, and without heeding her pressing invitation to remain and make the acquaintance of Mr. Brown, left the room and betook himself back to the parlors. He was just 1 minute too late. The last of the boarders had gone upstairs, and only an empty room met his eyes. He at once ascended to his own apartment. It was on the 4th floor. There were many other rooms on this floor, and for a moment he could not remember which one was his own door. At last, however, he felt sure it was the third one from the stairs, and going to it, gave a short knock in case of a mistake, and hearing no reply, opened it and went in. The first glance assured him that his recollection had played him false, and that he was in the wrong room. The second was that he was in that of Mr. Mansell. The sight of the small model of a delicate and intricate machine that stood in full view on the table before him would have been sufficient assurance of this fact, even if the inventor himself had been absent. But he was there, seated at a table with his back to the door and his head bowed forward on his arms. He presented such a picture of misery or despair that Mr. Byrd felt his sympathies touched in spite of himself, and hastily stumbling backward, was about to confusedly withdraw, when a doubt struck him as to the condition of the deathly, still, and somewhat pallid figure before him, and, stepping hurriedly forward, he spoke the young man's name, and, failing to elicit a response, laid his hand on his shoulder with an apology for disturbing him and an inquiry as to how he felt. The touch acted where the voice had failed. Leaping from his partly recumbent position, Craik Mansell faced the intruder with indignant inquiry written in every line of his white and determined face. "To what do I owe this intrusion?" he cried, his nostrils expanding and contracting with an anger that proved the violence of his nature when aroused. "First, to my carelessness," responded Mr. Byrd, "and secondly—" But there he paused, for the first time in his life, perhaps, absolutely robbed of speech. His eye had fallen upon a picture that the other held clutched in his vigorous right hand. It was a photograph of Imogene Dare, and it was made conspicuous by two heavy black lines which had been relentlessly drawn across the face in the form of a cross. "Secondly," he went on, after a moment, resolutely tearing his gaze away from this startling and suggestive object, "to my fears. I thought you looked ill, and could not forbear making an effort to reassure myself that all was right." "Thank you," ejaculated the other, in a heavy, weariful tone. "I am perfectly well," and with a short bow he partially turned his back, with a distinct intimation that he desired to be left alone. Mr. Byrd could not resist this appeal, glad as he would have been for even a moment's conversation with this man. He was, perhaps unfortunately, too much of a gentleman to press himself forward against the expressed wishes even of a suspected criminal. He accordingly withdrew to the door, and was about to open it and go out, when it was flung violently forward, and the ever obtrusive Brown stepped in. The second intrusion was more than unhappy Mr. Mansell could stand. Striding passionately forward, he met the unblushing Brown at full tilt, and angrily pointing to the door, asked if it was not the custom of gentlemen to knock before entering the room of strangers. "I beg pardon," said the other, backing across the threshold with a profuse display of confusion. "I had no idea of its being a stranger's room. I thought it was my own. I was sure that my door was the third from the stairs. Excuse me, excuse me," and he bustled noisily out. This precise reproduction of his own train of thought and action confounded Mr. Byrd. Turning with a deprecatory glance
at the perplexed and angry occupant of the room, he said something about not knowing the person who had just left them, and then, conscious that a further contemplation of the stern and suffering countenance before him would unnerve him for the duty he had to perform, hurriedly withdrew. Chapter 14.